Welcome back. This is meeting number 2 of the House of Commons Standing Committee on Access to Information, Privacy and Ethics, conformément à l'article 108.3H de règlement.
Pursuant to Standing Order 1083H, the committee will proceed today to a briefing session with the Conflict of Interest and Ethics Commissioner, followed by a briefing session with the Information Commissioner.
Is taking place in a hybrid format pursuant to the standing orders. Members are attending in person in the room, and I don't believe we have anybody on Zoom. Before we continue, I'm just going to ask all the participants to consult the guidelines written on the cards on the table. These measures are in place to help prevent audio and feedback incidents and to protect the health and safety of our participants, including the interpreters. And you'll also notice a QR code on the card which links to a short awareness video. I'd also like to make a few comments for the benefit of the witnesses and members. Please wait until you're recognized by name before speaking. For those participating by video conference, we have none. Click on the microphone. If there is anybody on there, click on the microphone to activate your mic. Reminder that all comments need to be addressed through the chair. For members in the room, if you wish to speak, please raise your hand. And in saying that, I'd like to welcome our witnesses for the first hour today. From the Office of the Conflict of Interest and Ethics Commissioner, we've got Mr. Conrad von Fichtenstein, who is the Commissioner. Sir, it's good to see you. It's been a long time. But we're finally, again, in front of each other. Lynn Robinson-Dalpé, Director, Advisory and Compliance. And Melanie Rushworth is here again. She's the Director of Communications, Outreach and Planning. Commissioner, welcome to committee. You have 5 minutes for opening remarks. Please go ahead.
Bonjour, Monsieur le Président. Comme vous savez.
Good morning, Chair. As you mentioned, I have with me Lynn Robinson-Dalpé and Melanie Rushworth. I'm pleased to review the role and mandate of our office. We administer the Conflict of Interest Code for members of the House of Commons and the Conflict of Interest Act for appointed federal officials. Given the committee's mandate, my remarks will focus on the Act.
The Act are called public office holders. They fall in 2 categories. Those appointed to full-time positions are called reporting public office holders. They must follow the Act's general conflict of interest rules, plus its reporting and public disclosure provisions. This means they must give the Commissioner's Office detailed personal and financial information about themselves and, in some cases, their family. The Office keeps most of that information secret. However, we are required by the Act to disclose some specific information. We do that in a reductive form, and it will be posted on the registry, which forms part of our website. Those appointed to part-time positions are referred to simply as public office holders. They have to follow the Act's general rules, but they do not have reporting requirement. La confidentialité et la transparence sont...
Confidentiality and transparency are both key to our work. Confidentiality encourages public officials to communicate freely and openly with us, and to ask us for advice when faced with a situation that may put them in a conflict of interest. Transparency means that we are as open as possible with Parliament and Canadians. This helps ensure the credibility of the Act and its administration.
Our work really supports 3 objectives. First of all, we foster public confidence that the actions of elected and appointed federal officials are free from conflict of interest. Secondly, we enable the most competent and qualified people to move in and out of the public service without any problems by helping them manage their conflict of interest. And lastly, we examine and report on allegations of conflict of interest that involve elected and federal appointed officials.
Our tools include a one-on-one interface with public officials, live educational sessions, online training, and investigations. A lot of the office's work is outlined in our latest annual reports that were tabled in Parliament in June. The report, under the Act, identifies 6 legislative changes that could help it function more effectively and administer the Act more efficiently.
I suggest you allow the lobbying commissioner, to step in front in temporarily if there is no conflict of interest to the commissioner. I.e., if I get run over by a truck tomorrow, there's somebody to do my job, which would be the lobbying commissioner. Secondly, we add the notion of apparent conflict of interest to the general duties of public office holders in a way to avoid the appearance of conflict of interest. Third, to allow some assets to designate it as exempt assets if they pose no risk to conflict of interest. For instance, electronic trading funds pose no conflict, but they are prohibited under the Act right now. Fourth, to allow public office holders to participate in matters affecting their private interests of their friends and relatives if those interests are the same as those of members of a broad class of which they are part of. This would make the Act consistent with the Code. Fifth, to allow the Commissioner to approve outside of activity that don't conflict with public office official duties but are presently forbidden. For instance, teaching at university on a subject which they know something about. And sixth, raise the maximum administrative monetary penalties to stress the importance of the reporting requirements of the Act. Right now, they're extremely low and they look like traffic offenses. That's basically my presentation. I will be happy to answer any of your questions.
Okay, thank you, Commissioner. As I said at the onset, it's been a while, and so lots to get caught up on. We're going to start our round of questioning with 6 minutes. I'm going to go to Mr. Barrett. You have the floor, sir. Go ahead.
Merci. Bon matin, commissaire.
Good morning, Mr. Commissioner.
Have you back at committee. It's been a year. A lot's gone on since then. I'll get right to it. Canadians can see which companies a designated public office holder held shares or options in before entering office, but not the value of those holdings. Does that level of disclosure give the public enough information to assess a potential conflict, or would value ranges better serve the public interest?
Well, the crafters of the Act already decided it's important for the public to know what a person owns, and it leaves it up to the Commissioner to make a decision as whether what to do with them. Most of the things that they own which are of consequence are either disposed or placed in a blind trust. It's only items that are below a minimum threshold that people can hold. And it seems to me that was a decision the legislature took to say, you want to respect the privacy of people, you want to encourage people to come. They don't have to disclose everything they own and how much. They have to deal with it in such a way that there's no conflict of interest. And that's the choice the legislatures took.
Would you suggest that a parliamentary that a review of the Act by Parliament should consider that question? You having said that this was a decision taken by Parliament at its last review to leave it alone and at its inception, there's no value ranges, and so they go into the blind trust. But if it's if it's a high performing stock, well, the trustee's not going to liquidate that. They're going to leave it in there, and the public office holder knows what they put in.
Yeah, it's as you know, first of all, it's in a blind trust. The public officer has absolutely no idea what the trustee will do with it, and he cannot give him direction. So the trustees, most of them, will just hold it. They can trade, that's a privilege, obviously, and they will do, but they also have to account later on to the person who placed the things in trust. So the best course is to basically just a passive holder, and that's what most of trustees do. But they are not restricted to it. Then secondly, if the public office holders obviously knows what he placed in the trust, etc., and if he makes decisions that could be germane to what's in the trust, etc., in those cases we establish what's called a screen, and in effect, make sure that the decision maker does not make decisions regarding his very valuable asset that he has in the portfolio, which will be directly affected by his decision, and it is an asset that is specific. It's not part of general legislation or covered by legislation or covered by a class.
So would mandatory divestment and independent reinvestment remove the perception and simplify compliance? The issue, if I may, the issue with the blind trust is that you take, for example, a prime minister who would have the clerk of the Privy Council, which is a political appointment, and their chief of staff, a political appointment, are the overseers of it, and there's no public indication when that screen has been used. And so there wouldn't be a need for a screen if the funds were simply divested and then reinvested by an expert, financial manager.
You're right, but it's a pretty simplistic solution, because you imagine you're suggesting that somebody who enters into public service sell all his assets, can increase a great tax liability, obviously, for that year, etc., and only then leave it up to a trustee to deal what's best, what he thinks the trustee thinks is best with the assets. It's something that can be done. I certainly wouldn't recommend it, because I think it would be very much discourage people from entering into public services. It would suggest that,
If I may, Commissioner,
great tax liability, and B, also very much interference in his personal...
If I may, sir, the objective here isn't about the encouragement of folks to run for office or to avoid tax liability, so much as it is to ensure that Canadians have confidence that the decisions taken by these public office holders are those that are in the best interest of their public, and there can be no appearance of a conflict or no perception that that they're taking decisions that are going to enrich themselves. And that's the root of my previous question. These conflict screens can cover dozens or hundreds of companies, but does your office have any ability to independently verify that the screen is triggered when required, or is it simply up to the political appointees of the designated public office holder to inform you?
Let me first of all
response,
correct you with your assumption. The Act has specifically sets out 5 purposes. The last 2 are encourage experienced and competent persons to seek and accept public office, facilitate the interchange between private and public sector, minimize the conflicts between private interests and public duties, and provide resolution of those conflicts. So part of my job is exactly that, making sure that the best people can get into the public service and out with the least conflict of interest.
Thank you, sir. Thank you, Mr. Barrett. Madame Lapointe, je vais donner un peu plus de temps.
Ms. Lapointe, I'll be giving you a bit more time because the response was a little bit too long. Thank you, Chair. It's a great pleasure for me to be back after this summer. I hope that everyone was able to rest and that you're ready to work. Thank you very much, Commissioner, for being with us this morning and for taking the time to explain to us what you have looked into and what we should perhaps modify. In your annual report, you made recommendations in order to create legislative amendments on the Conflict of Interest Act and the Parliament Act. What was the process? What brought you to these suggestions? I have been in this role for a year and a half, and so I made recommendations on elected officials. I used as an example somebody working for government. They are qualified in a given topic. They want to share this knowledge and teach at the Université de Montréal or Ottawa U, the university says, great, come teach, but you need to become an employee member, even if you won't be receiving a salary. There's an agreement with unions that people who teach at a university need to be employees. But to do that would be infringing upon the legislation. Why not give that government worker the opportunity to share their knowledge with students? There is no conflict of interest there, but technically it would be against the Act. So what you're saying, Commissioner, is that if we are elected officials and we would like to share our knowledge at a university because we have been invited to do so, currently we are not authorized to do it? I'm speaking specifically of reporting public office holders. So part of a ministerial team, they are subject to the Act. They cannot accept another position, but they would have knowledge that they would like to share, and the university would like to receive them. There is no conflict there, but currently it is not allowed. Great. So that's something that you would like to see changed. Would you like us to review the legislation? I would like to request the discretion to decide whether or not there is a conflict of interest. If somebody wants to teach and isn't being paid to do so, and there is no conflict of interest, they simply want to share their knowledge, why couldn't they be allowed to do so? If that is something that could be done, and if it is a conflict of interest, I would have to refuse that. And what brought you to that conclusion to suggest that? What did you study to come to such a conclusion? It's not up to me to change the legislation. It is up to you. But in my yearly report, I wanted to bring that up. This is something that happens frequently, and I find it frustrating that I would not be able to approve such a case. Understood. So you would like to have more powers there? Yes, I would like to have the discretion to decide. In this case, I have to refuse it. Do you believe that the committee should examine a targeted review of the Conflict of Interest Act? I think that the legislation should be reviewed. I believe that the last one was done a few years ago. Microphone, please. In 2013, there was a 5-year review that was done only once after the legislation was created, and then there was no permanent obligation to review this legislation every 5 years. So it has happened once, but no amendments were made following that 5-year review because of government changes and other things. Thank you. And so, you would like for us to look into the legislation and make amendments. It needs to be updated. There are certain issues with ETFs. And this is currently an issue. If you have $100 or $1,000 in ETFs, that shouldn't change your opinion. You can't influence these companies, but currently I would have to tell you to put it in a blind trust. Why? Because when the legislation was created, ETFs were different, and those who have no influence on politics should be allowed to have these. But currently, I don't have the ability to approve it, and there's no rule that says what's allowed. Everything is disallowed regarding public markets and public companies. That's prohibited. Thank you. Thank you, Ms. Lepointe. Thank you, Mr. Commissioner. Mr. Thériault, you have the floor for 6 minutes and a little bit more time because both parties took extra time. Thank you, Chair. Good day, Mr. Commissioner. And what I find concerning is that for the Prime Minister of Canada, we're in a never-before-seen situation. Brookfield, which is a management company, manages about $1 billion. The Prime Minister was responsible for this last January. According to the data bank by Statistics Canada, Brookfield controlled 916 companies as of December 31st, 2024. In your registry, and this is where I have a question, we can see that Mark Carney divested and on shares and other rights by creating a blind trust. And in your report, in your registry, it states that you implemented a filter against conflict of interest, and this is significant. This is appropriate compliance. I would like for you to explain how this conflict of interest filter works regarding a particular situation. This is very different from Paul Martin with his boat company. Answer. This filter is permitted with Section 29. The Commissioner can decide the measures to be applied so that public office holders are compliant to measures in the legislation. We can come to an agreement with public office holders. So this is what we use. And it went to the Court of Appeal, the Federal Court of Appeal, and we were told that the filter is an appropriate measure that can be used. Now, for the case of Mr. Carney, he divested and stated that everything was put into a blind trust. I can't remember the word in French. We want to avoid that there's a situation where a decision is made and one of his companies will know what to do in order to increase its value. And so that's why we created this filter. And every element presented to the Prime Minister needs to be assessed to see if there would be any issues. It'll have to be done by company. And then there might be cases where he would need to recuse himself. But if it's a general matter, it won't be necessary. But let's say that the Prime Minister needs to recuse himself 100 times because there could be a conflict of interest or appearance of conflict of interest. Is he seated in the right spot? I'm not asking you to respond, but that is a question that I've asked myself. Now, regarding minimal taxes at the global level, at the OECD, we want to avoid tax evasion by having a minimal percentage of 15% for multinational companies. These multinationals use tax havens in order to avoid paying taxes, and the country that hosts that would receive at least 15%. In C69, we adopted in June 2024 a legislation on minimal taxes that would start being implemented in 2025. The fiscal year started last year, and in November 2024, 2 months before the implementation of the law, Brookfield Asset Management moved its headquarters to the United States, and so it no longer needs to pay that 15% minimal tax. And at the G7, before going through the House of Commons, the Prime Minister decides during the G7 to exempt the United States because he transferred the headquarters to the United States and exempted the United States of that minimal global tax. Do you not believe that that's an ethical issue and could cause the appearance of a conflict of interest? And do you think that your filter could apply? Answer. This is a tax measure. It's universal. It applies to all companies, even Brookfield. That's something that needs to be done. There needs to be universal laws that will impact companies like Brookfield. Apologies, but at the G7, the United States were excluded, and so they were not required to pay their 15%. When did that decision happen? At the G7. It's the Prime Minister himself who made that announcement. And it would have been good for us to be able to ask the question in the House. This applies to Brookfield and a lot of other companies as well. And the reason behind that was because of frictions with the United States and President Trump. It was not in order to favor a single company here. Brookfield perhaps benefited from this, but I'm sure other companies did as well. If this is a legislation that applies generally, we wouldn't need to use the filter. Thank you. Your time is up. I gave each party 7 minutes for that first turn. So we're going to move on to the second round. Mr. Cooper, you have 5 minutes.
Mr. Chair, Commissioner, I want to ask you some questions about the Prime Minister's so-called ethics screen. First of all, the ethics screen is being administered by the Prime Minister's Chief of Staff and the Clerk of the Privy Council, correct?
Yes.
So we have the Chief of Staff, who is appointed by and works directly for the Prime Minister, and the Clerk of the Privy Council, who serves at the pleasure of the Prime Minister. These two individuals are hardly independent of the Prime Minister. So in the face of that, what assurance do Canadians have that the screen is being implemented and enforced properly?
Well, let's be practical. Anything that goes to the Prime Minister for decision goes to either one of these men or both. They are in effect, the key holders of what gets on his desk and what he deals with. So they are the logical ones to make sure he does not get involved in these things. And
Well, sir,
I'm just talking about purely administratively. If you want to install, you're the key people who determine who the last person, what goes to the Prime Minister are these two people. They, of course, have a whole...
Well, sir, I understand that it's administered by the Chief of Staff and the Clerk of the Privy Council, both of whom serve at the pleasure of the Prime Minister. And so I'm asking you, in the face of that, what assurance do Canadians have that the screen is actually being enforced properly? Are there any independent mechanisms that your office has to ensure that it, in fact, is being applied properly?
Because their interest is the same as the Prime Minister. They don't want to run a house, see the Prime Minister whom they serve run afoul of conflict of interest. That causes both political and legal problems. They are there to make sure that he complies with the law. It is their duty, and they have been assigned that duty, and surely they're going to exercise in such a way that there does not appear or does not arise a conflict of interest. That's their job.
So your answer is that the effectiveness of the screen rests on the Prime Minister's Chief of Staff and the Clerk of the Privy Council, right?
I rely on the integrity of the senior people in government acting in accordance with the law, because it's in their interest, it is in the interest of the Prime Minister.
So the answer, sir, is there are no independent mechanisms in place, correct?
No, not at all.
Okay.
I have just, don't forget, it's not there. Each one of them has a whole body of people working under him. They've all been instructed. We have given them lessons on how to do, etc. When in doubt, they will consult with us. They are very keen to have that nobody can raise a conflict of interest.
Well,
and that's their job.
Well, all I can say, no reporting, no transparency measures, no checks and balances. We're just left to take the word of Mark Carney and his two top advisors. I would say that falls short. Now, with respect to the ethics screen, Mr. Carney may participate in a discussion or a decision on a matter of general application or that affects interests of companies as a broad class of persons, unless those interests are disproportionate to other members. Now, disproportionate isn't defined in the screen, so what constitutes a disproportionate interest?
First of all, what's a class? A class is a whole bunch of persons who are affected by have one thing in common, right? And let's say, a perfect example would be farmers. Yeah, what are they also? It's a class. They all, you can have a subclass. They're wheat farmers, etc. Then you question if one of them is disproportionate. Let's say wheat farmers is probably a bad example, but it's, if one member of the class owns 60% or so, and the other one, the other 40, then clearly that person who has a 60% interest in that group of companies is a disproportionate, and the screen would apply. I can't give you a specific generic position because it depends on who we're dealing with and what the industry is and how widely or closely it is held.
That's it, Mr. Cooper. Thank you, Commissioner. We are now going to go to Ms. Church. Go ahead, please, for 5 minutes.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair. Colleagues, welcome back. Mr. Commissioner, thank you and your office for your guidance and vigilance at all times. Just a few questions from me. First of all, when were the provisions that pertain to establishing a blind trust enacted? Was it at the outset of the Act in?
As I say, that Section 29 basically says that the Commissioner can determine appropriate measures with public office holders, and one of them we came up with is this screen. My colleague wants to tell me something.
Section 27, which requires the divestment provisions, were also implemented at the onset of the Act, so in 2007.
2007. Thanks very much. And Commissioner, do you have a sense of how many blind trusts have been established, either annually, currently, or over time?
I don't have the number, but my colleagues will have it. It's not very many.
40.
I believe there's about 22 of them that are on average established in a year.
And would you be able to generalize the type of assets that you tend to see inside these trusts?
No, what the office holder puts in the trust is everything that we is not allowed to have, right? There's also mostly interest in companies, bonds and stuff like this. It's financial instruments. So he puts it in a blind trust, entitled to trustee. But of course, he's not blind to the fact that what he put in there. And so therefore, in order to avoid that, people can't, I put it in the blind trust, but then can take advantage and take measures that increase the value of what was put in the blind trust. We have created this screen. It's not very often that there's a situation where it's, as my colleague pointed out.
In your opening remarks, you mentioned how one of your objectives was not to discourage people from entering public office from a variety of backgrounds, particularly those with private sector experience. Would you agree that the profiles of the blind trust holders typically have some degree of private sector experience?
Yes, absolutely.
Mr. Commissioner, could you describe the reporting requirements required of public office holders under the Act?
Okay, why don't you walk them through, Lynn?
So essentially, when a public office holder, a reporting public office holder is appointed, they are provided a confidential report that they need to disclose. So in there, they have to disclose information on their assets, liabilities, outside activities, corporations, any information that, in addition to that, any information that the commissioner may be used to provide some guidance. So family members that have interests or that have dealings with the federal government, friends that have dealings with the federal government. So all of that is provided in the confidential report. At that point in time, the office, an advisor in the office will review the disclosure and establish which requirements are required. In the case of assets or assets that are deemed controlled, divestment is required. In some cases, a reporting public office holder must also step down from private companies in which they are like director or president or chair. So all of these measures are reviewed with the reporting public office holder, and they have a period of time to comply with that. So essentially, there's a lot of information, very similar to what is disclosed by members of parliament, but there are more concrete measures that are required for them to comply with the Act.
Great.
You got 30 seconds.
So just in summary then, what we have here is a tool that is commonly, maybe not frequently used, but commonly used, often with individuals with outside private experience coming into public office and with a system of regular reporting attached to it.
Correct. Yeah.
Thank you.
Good summary.
Okay, thank you, Ms. Church. Monsieur Thériault, pour 2 minutes et...
Mr. Thériault, you have 2.5 minutes. Let's go back to what we were talking about earlier. I understand what you need to apply, but I want to look at the core of ethics, what should be. And I'm waiting on your office to give us suggestions regarding what should be. I want people to come into politics, but if structurally what they own causes a structural conflict of interest, for example, you have a company with 916 smaller companies with an investment of $1 billion and a prime minister who proposes C5, for example, railway, natural gas, pipelines. These are all things targeted by C5, Westinghouse, nuclear facilities. ports, these are all things that are targeted by C5. And I think that there is an appearance of conflict of interest. And in this case, this legislation was passed without discussion, and we weren't able to measure this. Do you not believe that not knowing how much this is going to have an impact on his blind trust, he probably knows that Brookfield will benefit from it? And I think that this shows a structural deficiency that is unacceptable. We can't make decisions when we know that they will serve us. Should everyone come do politics? I think people need to make a choice. And when we're looking at such a situation, I would expect from the Commissioner of Ethics to give us the tools to avoid conflicts of interest. The example that you gave is a selection of projects. This was in the national interest with these projects. This doesn't show who will be doing the work, who will be receiving government support, who will be choosing companies, what the impact will be for companies. So we need to look at Brookfield, yes, but we are not at the moment of making a decision regarding who is going to benefit from all of this. We need to see what C5 will do, who will be chosen, which companies. At that time, those who are responsible for these screens will decide, is one of these companies going to participate? Is it Brookfield? These are all things that will be subject to the screen at that point. Currently, there is not a conflict of interest, and the screen does not apply. Thank you, Mr. Commissioner. Mr. Thériault, that is the end of your time. We're going to move on to a third turn, 5 minutes for Mr. Hardy and 5 minutes for Mr. Abdelhak. And Mr. Thériault, we might have a bit of time for you to ask more questions, and I do have time. I have a question for Mr. Commissioner. Mr. Hardy, you have the floor. Thank you. Mr. Commissioner, I'm new to politics, but I believe that a lot of people should participate and should get into politics to make a difference. But I believe that politics recently are something that people don't trust as much. And the Ethics Committee is here to ensure that people can trust our institutions again. Knowing that a multi-millionaire is at the head of the country, do you believe that our current legislation would allow Canadians to understand whether or not this person is there for the right reasons and not just to help his company before moving back to the private market? I think that the current legislation works. There can be improvements made, as I mentioned. The issue is not with clear conflicts of interest, it's with the appearance of a conflict of interest. That is why, in my yearly report, I suggested the creation of a definition that needs to be respected in the case of an appearance of a conflict of interest. It is difficult to define and to apply, but I do believe that it is essential for that trust that you mentioned. There was the Oliphant Commission that looked at Mr. Mulroney and others. And in that report, there was a recommendation, and it gave a definition of the appearance of a conflict of interest. Would you mind reading? The definition should be reviewed in order to encompass the appearance of conflict of interest regarding where a person who is well informed could have a reasonable perception that the ability of a public office holder would be able to take on, or rather, could have been tainted by a personal interest, their own personal interest, or by the personal interest of a family member or friend. Microphone, please. If people are wondering how things could happen, for example, with the Prime Minister, who's a multi-billionaire, who is at the head of companies, he is now making decisions very rapidly on the future of the country, but is also helping out companies that he owned. And so somebody should be able to verify this beyond his own cabinet. The Prime Minister is rich, but that doesn't mean that there's a conflict of interest. I do know what you're saying. We can't only ban direct conflicts. We also need to look into the appearance of a conflict of interest. And that is why we need to adopt measures to avoid this. But firstly, we need to amend the legislation to make improvements and adopt a definition. So we would look into it if there are more and more projects and more potential conflicts of interest. How many people look into this to see if there's an issue, if it needs to be raised, if it needs to be analyzed? In an abstract case, it's difficult to respond to your question. In a given case, we would look at the projects. Is it in the national interest or not? After that, who was chosen for these projects? And so there are decisions made regarding projects, and we need to see whether or not there are direct conflicts of interest or the appearance of a conflict of interest. But let's say there are 12, 15, 20 potential conflicts of interest. How many people will look into that? Can it happen quickly enough for us to intervene? Or is it something that we'll notice 5 years too late and everything will have changed and the problem will have had time to occur? Answer. If we adopt such a definition, we also need to adopt a process to decide whether or not it will be up to me. Will we increase oversight? Inaudible. Thank you very much, Mr. Hardy, Mr. Commissioner.
5 minutes. Go ahead, sir.
Thank you. Alors, tout d'abord, merci beaucoup pour la présentation.
Thank you for the presentation, and welcome back. I've heard your presentation and about the letter. In our country, we need to encourage people with experience to have access to these decision-making positions. We need expertise in our different cabinets and government. That said, our committee will be looking into recommendations, and I would like to ask you a question. How do you see the study that our committee needs to do? Do we need to target specific recommendations? And you talked about context, but should we look at it more globally and review the process in its entirety. My recommendations are up to date and have to do with my concerns and things that it would be appropriate to change. I think there needs to be global changes, and we need to take into account the fact that the world is different. We need to look at the role of social media and all of these other potential implications for the legislation. We need to make targeted amendments. The legislation is more than due. When you say make improvements, you're talking about a change of context, and context changes a lot more quickly now. Do you believe that the legislation needs to be more agile? Because we're talking about specific cases more and more and projects, but the legislation is not made for that. And we're looking more at appearances of conflict of interest now. It is up to you, parliamentarians, to see what the approach should be. My task currently is to observe and share shortcomings and things that I believe need to be changed. We need to look at how there is an office for lobbying and conflict of interest, and could things be seen together? I think all of these need to be looked into. Thank you. I have a last question. Will the scope be larger, or are there any limits on this review? I'm not sure I understand your question. So regarding the review of the legislation, does it need to be on specific elements, or does it need to be globally reviewed? We're talking about whether things need to be urgent. Should the scope be larger or more targeted? That it comes back to my first question, actually. If we could have amendments like the ones I mentioned, I would be very happy, but I don't think in the long term that it's enough. We need to do more. Thank you, Mr. Sarri. Mr. Theriault, you have 2.5 minutes if you'd like. Great. I would like to come back to that screen for conflict of interest. You implemented this because of the situation. And so, this has to do with the conflict of interest, somebody coming from the private sector that is not becoming a simple minister. That would be a different case. This is the prime minister that makes all of the decisions for the country. Your screen is administered, and it's not you that implements it. You're not the one who is in constant contact with those two people in cabinet. But do you not believe that somebody external should have to do this? And before giving someone the opportunity to use this screen, did you verify whether or not those people have a conflict of interest? Microphone, please. I'm speaking of at the office. I believe that conflict of interest screen was managed by you and not by people who are close to the Prime Minister, who are hired by the Prime Minister, have you verified their potential conflict of interest? Was that verified before making them responsible for the application of the conflict of interest screen? That would be a conflict of interest for me. I cannot participate and judge at the same time. If there's a conflict of interest, I would have to be the one to decide. Now, how does this screen work? I am not satisfied with this screen. I don't understand how it could reassure Canadians. It's a statement, but the implementation is insufficient. It's not my opinion. It's that I'm not receiving an answer to my question, Mr. Commissioner. Thank you, Mr. Thériault.
I do have a couple of questions, and it relates to the specifics of the reporting mechanism, Commissioner. When a public office holder, does a public office holder have to declare either deferred stock options, stock units, or any future bonuses tied to any of the previous companies that they were affiliated with? Would that be part of their ethics disclosure?
Yes, it is.
Okay. So here's the question that I have, Commissioner, and it's along the lines of what Mr. Thériault was asking. When these the screens are set up, wouldn't that cause a reasonable person to conclude that the public office holder is in fact benefiting from those deferred stock options, units, and future bonuses, despite the fact that the blind trust is being set up? Now, if that public officer holder, for example, was a prime minister whose major policy platforms were, for example, housing, infrastructure, EV mandates and all that stuff, wouldn't that cause a reasonable person to conclude that they are in fact benefiting, blind trusts notwithstanding, screens notwithstanding, that they are in fact benefiting as a result of the decisions that are being made, major policy decisions in this country? Wouldn't that cause a reasonable thinking person to conclude that there is in fact a conflict and that person is in fact benefiting as a result of these decisions?
Well, you have just enunciated the major argument why people don't like the idea of apparent conflict of interest, because it is possible to view things that way or other way. You can also put it the other way around, saying he has earned those deferred benefits already. He's getting them in the future. He's getting them from one of the largest companies in the country. So how can you personally be, where is the conflict of interest? There is no way that the decision will have an impact on the deferred money that he's getting in the future. Now, that's why when you talk to a parent, conflict of interest, you have to take the balance of how people see it, and is it possible to give the apparent conflict of interest, or is it really just unfortunately, it looks like that, but effectively there is nothing that influences the personal interest of the person that's involved. They are very appearances of conflict of interest, as I meant in the decision that was read out and that Mr. Oliphant suggests, is you take basically how does a reasonable person outside, knowing fully well the situation, would regard that, etc. And this fully well, the information is key. You have to understand how a deferred benefit works, how it was earned, and etc. So I don't know how to answer your question, Mr. Chair. It's the best I can do.
Thank you, Commissioner. I really appreciate the time that you've spent with us today. Ms. Rushworth, thank you for being here. And Ms. Dalpe, I understand that this may be your last appearance before this committee in advance of your retirement. So I want to wish you well, great health, great happiness in that retirement. And I'm going to suspend for a couple of minutes while we have the Information Commissioner coming up next. Thank you, Commissioner, for your time today. Meeting suspended. Office of the Information Commissioner of Canada, Caroline Maynard, who is the Information Commissioner. It's been a while, Ms. Maynard. We want to welcome you back to Ethics. You have up to 5 minutes for your opening statement. Go ahead, please.
Perfect. Thank you. Je vous remercie de m'avoir invité à comparaître devant vous aujourd'hui.
Thank you for inviting me today. I've had the honor to serve as Canada's Information Commissioner since March 2018, and I always welcome the opportunity to speak to this committee. For returning members, some of what I will cover in my opening remarks may already be familiar. Canada's access to information legislation gives Canadians the right to know how their government operates. The Supreme Court of Canada has described this right as quasi-constitutional. Every year, Canadians exercise their right of access by submitting over 200,000 requests for records under the control of government institutions. These requests often touch on topics at the heart of our democracy: how tax dollars are being spent, how programs and services are administered, how government contracts are awarded and to whom, and what measures are being taken to strengthen our economy, to name just a few.
Background materials I have provided, my role is to enforce the Access to Information Act using the full range of tools and powers at my disposal. For the past 7 years, I have investigated thousands of complaints related to access requests. I have issued orders to institutions since I was given that power in 2019, and I have also pursued litigation to enforce the law and uphold Canadians' right of access. When the Act came into force in 1983, it was considered groundbreaking. But over the decades, governments have failed to keep it up to date. Neither the Act nor the system that supports it reflect the realities of how information is created, shared, and used in today's world. Let me give you a picture of what that means in practice. In many institutions, responding to access requests requires searching through thousands of electronic records that have not been properly managed, or going through boxes or cabinets of documents that have not been adequately archived. And all too often, manual redactions, duplicate removal, and other labor-intensive processes relying on outdated technologies impede the efficiency of these researchers. These performance deficiencies, combined with a persistent culture of secrecy, often result in institutions failing to meet their obligations under the Act. We now have both an Act and a system that are unfit to meet the information needs of Canadians. Last June, the government launched a legislative review, as required by the Act. I hope it moves swiftly and results in meaningful changes to both the Act and the system that supports it. I truly look forward to playing an active role in this review and any other reviews Parliament chooses to undertake, with the hope that it will result in a full and comprehensive overhaul of the Act. Canadians deserve an access law worthy of this great country. At a time of growing misinformation and public skepticism, Canada must be a leader in transparency and accountability for the sake of our democracy. This also means that the access to information and privacy function must be properly resourced within each institution to uphold this legal obligation. Alors que le gouvernement procède à un examen.
As the government carries out a comprehensive expenditure review to ensure that public spending is responsible, cost-effective, and delivers real results for Canadians, institutions must carefully assess the risks that come with any reduction in access to information capacity. Access to information is not a service. It is a right enshrined in law. Next week marks Right to Know Week, a time each year when we shine a spotlight on Canadians' right of access. It is the perfect opportunity to remind ourselves that modernizing the Access to Information Act to increase transparency is one of the most powerful ways to strengthen the trust between citizens and their government and to protect our democracy. Thank you. Thank you, Madam Commissioner. We're going to start with our first round of questions. Mr. Barrett, you have 6 minutes.
Mr. Barrett, I'm going to keep it at 6 minutes. We went a little over last time, so we're not going to do that this time. Okay, thank you.
Commissioner, it's a pleasure to have you back here. Before I get into some of my questions about your work, I'd like to ask you for your thoughts about ours. Our committee issued a report last year, and I wonder if you have any comments you'd like to share with us about it.
As you saw in the submission that I've made, I agreed with most of the recommendations made by this committee after your review. I think that the government needs to review those reports made by your committee and my submissions, including what they received from the public and during the consultations. And I'm hoping that they will start from there and not start from scratch.
Thank you very much. In your 24-25 annual report, you wrote that some institutions neither implemented your legally binding orders nor went to federal court, quote, breaking the law, end quote, forcing you to seek writs of mandamus. Are you standing by your finding that certain federal institutions have broken the law by ignoring your orders? And can you confirm whether the Department of National Defense is the worst offender?
I have issued 8 mandamus applications because of 8 orders that were not contested in court. It is the institution's right to not comply with an order as long as they challenge it in court. When they refuse to do so, I have been forced to take action myself. Out of those 8 mandamus, I think the National Defense has received about 6 of them. I have to say, though, good news is the National Defense is doing much better. I don't know if it's because of these mandamus application, but this year we've received the lowest amount of complaints against National Defense. It's not even in my top 5 institutions that are not meeting the act this year.
So they're breaking the law less?
Yes.
Oh, well.
They're respecting the act.
There's something to be said for progress. You launched an investigation into ArriveCAN over allegations related to the destruction of records that were subject to the Act. Is destroying or deleting records that are subject to access to information requests a breach of the Act? And do your preliminary findings suggest that the law was broken in this case?
With respect to ArriveCAN, I'm sorry, but I won't be able to talk to you about the investigation. It's still ongoing. This is a very complex investigation, and as you just mentioned, including very serious allegations. So my office, it's part of our priority this year to finalize that investigation, and I will be happy to report on that investigation later this year. With respect to the allegation of destructions, it is a criminal act if it's intentional and if it's meant to remove the information from somebody's accessing it. So I cannot tell you at this point what our findings are with respect to ArriveCAN.
In your 2024-2025 report, you said that nearly 30% of requests across government missed legislated timelines in the previous year. In plain terms, does missing the deadline on almost a third of requests mean that the government, writ large, is failing to adhere to the law?
It is.
And what do you think is the remedy that's needed?
Well, currently, the Act is requiring institutions to respond within 30 days of an access request or to ask for an extension. 30% or 33% of these requests are not being, that timeline is not being met. There's all kinds of factors. consultations with other institutions taking way too long is one of them. Mismanagement of information and resulting in huge size of access and documents having to be processed is another one. There's a lot that needs to be done to the system, as I said in my submission in 2020, a lot to be done to this act to modernize it. Reducing consultations to a certain amount of time would be one of the way to reduce timelines as well.
I think you said that the government's plan for modernization is not sufficient. I think those were your words. But on the stick that might need to be used here, because I don't think that there's any amount of carrots that would move the needle. What do peer countries do? What is the harshest or most effective measure that's used for compliance in other countries? Are we an outlier here? It seems extraordinary to have a government that seems to be flouting this very important law.
Unfortunately, I've met with other colleagues from around the world, and we're not the only one having issues implementing the Act. Whether or not we have a good, perfect Act, it's in the implementation that really we can see if a country is doing well. Sanctioning public servants is not happening in any other countries because it's really difficult to know which person is responsible ultimately for the decisions.
The buck stops with the minister at the end of the day.
That's what I think.
Okay.
I think the head of the institution should be responsible.
Thank
Wonderful.
you, Commissioner.
Thank you, Commissioner. Ms. Church, you have 6 minutes. Go ahead, please.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Welcome, Commissioner. I'm interested in getting a little bit of a better sense of just the lay of the land. Can you talk to us or share your experience in terms of characterizing how the volume and maybe the size of the production has changed in the time that you've followed access to information?
Well, it is one of the issues is that when the Act was implemented in 1983, adopted, we were dealing with files, paper. You know, it was easy to print what was really an official document and save it somewhere. Now we're dealing with a digital world that people are using emails to make decisions. People are using text. They're using Teams. They're using videos. I don't think that the Act it was meant for this amount of information, and basically people have been negligent in managing their information. There's a lot of institutions that don't have a maximized size of inbox, so people can keep everything. They don't have to clean up, and which is it's ridiculous. The amount of files that we see where somebody is looking for relevant information throughout 30,000 pages of documents, it's really not responding to the needs, like I said earlier. And we need to find a way to make public servants more responsible to manage their information. We need to find a way to use maybe artificial intelligence to remove duplicates. There's all kinds of technology out there, but right now it's not being used. And we are seeing files that are not reasonable in sizes in terms of requests.
You mentioned the designation of an official document or an official record. Can you just describe what that encompasses?
Well, currently it's not really, the Act refers to any records. So if a document is not removed from your inbox and there's an access request, you have to provide that document. It's part of the record. But the policy under the Treasury Board of Canada is that you can remove transitory documents, and you should keep documents that have business values. And that's really depending on different decisions. Some people will keep, all the drafts that leads to a decision, especially if it shows the way that the decision was made. There's no, it's really a case by case, but right now I think a lot of people are keeping everything just to make sure that they don't, where there should be better policies and better directives, or maybe a legislative definition of an official document with respect to, so that people know what they're supposed to do and what their responsibilities are.
So people are keeping more than they ought to out of a heightened concern around compliance, is what you're saying.
Sometimes, yes, and other people, like, you also have allegations that people are not keeping enough. And we do have some cases where a decision is made and you have difficulties understanding how come documents have not been created for those decisions. And that's also concerning.
Well, you raised the point about technology, and that's obviously part of the challenge here with just the number of platforms, the types of technology that we're using for information storage, for basic communications in government. What are some of the ways that you think that a government could use technology better to improve information management and access to information?
I'm not an expert, but I am sure there are ways to integrate artificial intelligence or technologies that will identify relevant information instead of every record that deals with one word. We had an example in my office when somebody asked for one word, and pretty much all the documents we created had that one word, so you cannot process that. So we have to find ways to work with technology to remove duplications. We have to find ways to better manage that information. That's not my expertise, but I'm sure that the government should definitely hire more IT specialists to determine those. And there's some countries that are already implemented some of those technologies. So we should be looking at what are the best practices out there.
Are there countries that you would point us to right now for those best practices on advanced technology solutions for this?
I know Australia is one of the countries that is using AI a lot more than that I've heard from other the places. Yeah, that's the first country that comes to mind.
And you also raised the objective of combating misinformation and disinformation. Can you speak a little bit to that and how you see the access to information regime as helping us address that issue?
Well, I think the act is, I always say the access request that doesn't need to be made is the best access request, because if the information is out there, if the information is reliable, if there's a policy on proactive disclosure, Canadians need to know that they can rely on the information that they're reading and that they're accessing and they obtain, whether it's through journalists, or it's through their member of parliaments. But right now, if it's difficult to obtain even the reliable information from the government, where should they turn? Where are they going to turn? And that's where misinformation comes. Like we are doing such great job. The public service, is providing advice based on facts and statistics, and that information should be out there. We shouldn't have to respond to ask for it.
Thank you. Thank you, Ms. Church. Thank you, Commissioner. Monsieur Thériault pour 6 minutes.
Merci.
Monsieur Thériault, you have 6 minutes. Thank you, Chair. Welcome, Madam Commissioner. You play a very significant role, and the Access to Information Act is not something that I was very knowledgeable on, but I read about it, and I read your report and was shocked to see that since 1983, there are very few things that have changed. As an opposition party will make a lot of requests, but then once we're in government, well, our views change, and it's a bit of a game. And that's what I seem to have noticed in reading the report. I was wondering, what causes that structurally? And what would allow us to counter that? There is supposedly a person responsible for access to information in every department. That person reports to the minister, I believe. And if you were responsible for that person, do you think that things might be improved? Answer. Currently, the administration of access to information falls under the Treasury Board, but each institution needs to have an operational unit, and they implement the procedures for responding to an access to information request. I'm not sure if an independent institution could have access to documents. That would be quite difficult. Applying the legislation, and to come back to the beginning of your question, the legislation was created to give access to information with certain restrictions. Since 1983, people see the Act as being a way to stop access to information. Instead of looking at it in a way to see which information should be shared, they look at which information should be protected, redacted. And so the goal of that legislation shifted. Having a central unit in government could potentially help with the administration. In Alberta, for example, they have a centralized unit, a team, but they still need to verify things with the minister, and so it is still up to the leader of that institution to decide. So I'm not sure that it would make a big difference. What needs to change is the culture at government, and there needs to be a culture of transparency. People need to realize that sharing information is a good thing, that it's a good thing for parties to have access to information for public debates. It's positive for democracy, but I think that people are afraid and they hide behind the access to information legislation, and that's why it's not a perfect process. So for people to understand, you're saying that I could make a request with a given department and they could give me the information, but currently I'm told to do an ATIP request and they know that it's going to take forever. You could make a request, but it would be considered an informal request, and often people will apply the legislation anyway, or they'll find a way to redact certain information or remove certain information. But they should want to give you as much information as possible so that you can understand a decision that was made, that you can understand something that was implemented, what the services are. And often, information is removed, so you might not trust it, because you might wonder, why is that information being hidden? So it's a culture of being opaque instead of transparent. This comes back to what I was saying at the beginning. There are people that need to manage this information. This is an essential piece of legislation. It's essential to our democratic values, and in the current era that we find ourselves in, we need to be able to fight disinformation and misinformation. This is a significant legislation that perhaps needs to be strengthened, and we can talk about that later. I can't believe that departments don't have someone to manage a request. And if that person reports to a department or a minister, well, I don't think that the culture will change much. That's why I was wondering whether or not having a person report to the information commissioner, perhaps that it would be a little bit different. Perhaps we could come closer to the original intent of the legislation, but perhaps we could come back to this in a previous round of questions. Thank you, Mr. Thériault. Thank you for staying in time.
Second round, Mr. Cooper, 5 minutes. Go ahead.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Commissioner, to be clear, your orders are legally binding, correct? They are. Now, you had indicated, and your report outlines, that non-compliance on the part of government departments and institutions has been an issue. So those government departments and institutions that are not abiding by your orders are breaking the law, are they not?
Well, if they are challenging them in court, they're not. They are allowed to challenge it, but if they're not challenging them and they're not respecting them, they are breaking the law.
And there are government departments and institutions that have chosen to ignore your orders and therefore are breaking the law.
It was an issue at the beginning. It seems to be less of an issue now. I think people understood that we now have been using the amendments application to force them into it.
Now, you indicated in answer to Mr. Barrett that your office has been forced to bring not one, not two, but 8 applications for writs of mandamus to force non-compliant, law-breaking departments and institutions to abide by the law. Now, going to federal court is costly, it's resource intensive, is it not?
It is.
And so can you provide a number, a figure, or provide some description of the degree in terms of, from a resource standpoint, your office has incurred in order to effectively drag government departments and institutions kicking and screaming to comply with your lawful order?
Well, currently the Act doesn't make me monitor these decisions and these orders. But if somebody complains to my office that the order was missed, the only recourse that I have currently is to make an application for mandamus, which we've done. We have increased our number of litigators in terms of cost. It's salaries, and time for us, and sadly, in a sense, it's time for the requesters as well, because so far none of these mandamus applications have made it to a hearing. The institutions have always responded before we were able to get a judge to listen to our application. So basically, it's been just extra time to the institutions to respond.
But it's fair to say it is resource intensive.
Yeah.
Okay, thank you for that. And on March 7th, 2025, you wrote to then President of the Treasury Board, Jeanette Pettipas-Taylor, expressing concern about this pattern of non-compliance and had requested that the minister issue clear and unequivocal guidance to institutions subject to the Act of their legal responsibilities, including complying with your orders. Did the minister issue such guidance?
She did.
She did. Okay, thank you for that. Now, is it fair to say that your office faces a persistent and severe funding shortfall?
Well, this year we were looking at a deficit of $600,000 based on the collective agreement that were negotiated and for which money that we didn't receive. But because of the review that the government has launched, we've decided to absorb that deficit. And we're not, I can't say that we're in a situation where we don't have sufficient funds, but we are definitely just enough to, we're managing our resources as best as we can based on the current situation in the government.
Thank you. And in 2024, you had submitted an off-site proposal to Minister of Justice requesting $400,000 in permanent funding to maintain current resource levels. What happened with your request?
It didn't go anywhere.
The minister did not respond?
The ministers did not respond, no.
Okay. Shifting back to your orders, the right to go to federal court for a review for those departments and institutions that apply for a review, the standard at the federal court is de novo, of a de novo nature. Now, your predecessor, Suzanne Legault, stated that there was, quote, no incentive for institutions to provide sufficient reasons to establish that information warrants not being disclosed during investigations, and for those reasons recommended removing the de novo standard. Do you agree?
Quick response, please.
It's a very tough questions because
know.
there's positive and negative on both judicial review and de novo review, and I would be happy to provide you some submissions in writing if you want on that.
Or maybe there will be another round. Maybe we can come
yeah.
back to it, okay? Or the submissions.
Because it's
up
a
to Mr.
complex.
Cooper. Okay, thank you, Ms. Menard. Monsieur Sarret pour 5 minutes, s'il vous plaît.
Mr. Sari, for 5 minutes. Thank you, Ms. Maynard. You are very welcome to this committee. This subject is very interesting, and it's interesting at different levels of government. But I would like to start by saying that there's an increase of information, and so there are more access to information requests. So more information to share, more things to authorize, and especially with the collaborative tools that we have now. Now, I would like to know what you think. The non-compliance regarding the legislation, is it based on that, receiving a request and responding to it, and sometimes it is impossible to offer that information in 30 days. It's the process that is more complicated, especially when elements need to be redacted. Answer: the legislation states that if an extension is requested, the institution has 30 days to make that request. But often, access units don't have enough information in those 30 days to know how much extra time they're going to need. As you said, the number of pages can be significant. We often see units in a department that don't respond in the 30 days to an access to information request. So it's very difficult to make a request for an extension that is reasonable, and this often leads to complaints submitted to my office. The number of pages, the number of documents, yes, this is an issue. But is it because of the access to information legislation, or is it because of the mismanagement of those documents? I would like to come back to this matter of mismanagement. As a government, we can try to be efficient, and I'll be coming back to the use of AI, as my colleague mentioned. I don't see you talk about that in your report and in your recommendations, but is this something that we should focus on in order to make improvements? The quantity of information, if I compare it to 2010, it has increased exponentially. If on the decision-making process we had hundreds of thousands of pages, now we have millions of pages. So, should we use AI? Should your office recommend its use? AI is not a tool that we can use if we haven't correctly managed information from the start. The tool can be used in order to remove duplication and to find information, but if there's so much information that has not been correctly managed and we don't know where the information is, the tool won't necessarily be helpful. And so to start, we need to better manage the information and then examine the use of AI. I would like to come back to your letter from May 13th, 2025 to Treasury Board. Can you explain why things are urgent? My letter to Treasury Board? Yes. That letter sought to remind the President of Treasury Board that there should be a legislative review every 5 years, and this year is the year where this review should happen. And I also sought to remind them that the process needs to be done as quickly as possible. There are a lot of consultations that were already done, reports, recommendations were made by experts. We know what the issues are with the current legislation. We understand the issues within the system as well. And so I'm hoping that the legislative review will happen quickly and lead to concrete results. Quick question, a yes or no answer. When you're talking about experts, are there IT experts that were consulted as well? I don't know. Thank you very much. Thank you. Thank you to you both.
In the requests for review, for as long as I've been here anyways, I've been hearing you say that often. Monsieur Thériault, pour 2 minutes 30 secondes.
You have 2.5 minutes. Thank you. When an elected official needs to ensure accountability in government, one of the main tools is the Access to Information Act. It was implemented for a reason. So, what I'm hearing is that how information is handled is deficient. Documents aren't being classified properly. It takes too long, and so the legislation needs to be amended. And what would you like to see changed? What are your priorities? It doesn't matter if you only give a couple, but what do we need to focus on? I'm sure you've got ideas. Yes, I sent in submissions in 2020 on opening legislation to the cabinet of the Prime Minister, because currently they are not subject to the legislation, so reports from those offices are not accessible. This also should apply to entities that work for government, and so if taxpayer dollars are used for services, these companies should be subject to the Act. Cabinet confidences currently are not revised by my office. We cannot see them. And this is something that should not be excluded from the legislation. This is often an exclusion that is applied on documents, and there's currently no one who can see these documents. I can't see it, a judge can't see it. I'm not saying that these documents need to be accessible, but there should be a process to review these documents to ensure that the legislation is being applied correctly. There should also be limitations regarding consultations within institutions. Currently, institutions have 30 days to respond, but there's no timeline on institutions that are consulted internally. And so this leads to a lot of delays regarding the implementation of the Act. So exemptions, exclusions, there are a few things that need to be looked at. Thank you, Madam Commissioner and Mr. Thériault. Mr. Hardy, we're going to start the third round. You have 5 minutes. Thank you very much. Thank you, Madam Commissioner, for being with us. So your directives are mandatory. Departments need to follow them and give access to information to everyone, correct? Microphone, please. Yes. Are there any that don't follow your recommendations? The legislation allows them, if they don't agree with the order, to bring the matter to court. They have a certain time to do that, but if they don't, they need to respect the order. It's happened in a few cases where they didn't bring this to the court and they did not respect the order, And so I had to take steps in order to force them to respect the order. It's happened a few times. It's happened with national defense and with other institutions. What happens when you decide to take them on? I imagine that eventually they will be forced to act, or are they just slowing things down? They're going to give it to you eventually, but they're slowing the process down. For cases that made it to court, we did not make it in front of a judge because the institution responded to the request before receiving a court order. So the issue was solved in that matter. Is that a strategy, do you think? So instead of having a system that is clear and accessible and transparent, we're abusing the system and trying to find ways to slow it down and decide which documents are going to be given. You're supposed to have access to information in 30 days. If you don't, you can file a complaint with my office. And once the office makes a decision, we expect the institution to respect that decision, or we'll take the matter to court. But it is a costly process, and so it's perhaps not a tactic used to buy time. Access to information is important. Everyone wants to know what's going on, and people trust their governments less and less. Do you believe that we should fund these efforts more so that Canadians can trust our system and so that you can do your work correctly? I believe that access units and my office should be sufficiently funded in order to apply the legislation. But the government should start by giving this information out before an access to information request is submitted. We want to focus on voluntary sharing of information by default. Information should be accessible on websites. People should be able to have easy access to this information to better understand decisions made and policies they might not agree, but at least they can understand. We want transparency. Do you think that that's what's happening, that funding is being offered, or is it the opposite? With the federal government, I hear that things are very costly to share information because it needs to be shared in both official languages. I've also heard that there are people that are afraid of sharing information. It's, again, a culture of secrecy. But I think that if the leaders of different departments promote transparency and understand the importance of Canadians being able to trust their government institutions and elected officials, information should be more available and accessible. Access to information is important for the future. And do you believe that in departments and in politics and in our institutions, are we keeping more documents than before? We were saying earlier that there are so many documents, so many emails. Is this a problem, or are there too many things being deleted too quickly? Unfortunately, at my office, we're seeing things repeat. If you spoke to the previous commissioner, the same issues were being raised, the same concerns, and it becomes more and more significant because there are more and more requests. We're talking about 200,000 access to information requests that were made. Do you have the impression, do I have time for one last question? No, unfortunately, your time is up, Mr. Hart. Ms. Lapointe, you're sharing your time with your colleague, Mr. Seni. Can start, followed by Ms. Lapointe for 5 minutes.
Madam Commissioner, I'm a new member, so excuse me if I don't our legislation compared to the other developed countries like England, England, Australia, New Zealand, and USA, how comparative are we? And is our compliance less than those or on a par level with the other countries? And what do we need to bring those level up to?
Our legislation is now, there is one institution that reviews legislation, and they will rank them compared to other countries. And I think Canada is now 58 out of 109 legislation. So we're kind of in the middle. Our act is not the best in terms of its accessibility and transparency and the level to which it's the institution that it's applicable to. One of the place that I like comparing ourselves to is Scotland. Scotland has a very progressive legislation. The commissioner over there has also the authority to monitor institutions and how they're doing, which I don't. There's a lot of also legislation that allows the Office of the Information Commissioners to do outreach and education, which I do, even though it's not my act, because I think it's important for people to understand what their rights are and how it's applicable. The implementation of legislation is really hard to monitor because it's within the administration of the government. And each institution is doing differently. So we have institutions that are doing really well and others are not doing as well with the same act. So this is something that's, so far, there's not a lot of tools out there to say which countries is doing better than others. But interestingly, like in Brazil, they don't have an independent commissioner, but every access request is on their website. Every time that it takes to respond to an access request is available. There's some tools out there that exist, and every time I see something like that, I tell TBS because I want them to compare and to see what best practices exist. But clearly, Canada can do better. We used to be doing really well, and at this point, we're not meeting up with the current principles in legislation.
Madame Lapointe, 2 minutes, 10 secondes.
Merci beaucoup. Ms. Lapointe, thank you very much. Thank you for responding to my colleague's question regarding those countries. So you talked about the requests made every year. What is the evolution of the access to information request? You've been a commissioner since 2018. Every year it increases by about 20%. So every year there are more requests, and every year my office receives about 3 to 5% of those requests as complaints. Can you tell us where these requests are coming from? Is it from people, from elected officials? Treasury Board would have that information, but most requests come from corporations. Often immigration agents are considered corporations, so a lot of requests are made for the immigration department. So a lot of access to information requests are coming in because of immigration files. The legislation was created in 1983. Has it been updated since? The only significant update happened in 2019. The act itself, legislation exclusions were not reviewed, but I was able to give orders. Before 2019, commissioners were only able to make recommendations. And earlier, you and colleagues mentioned that because the information is found on different means, before it used to be paper documents, how are you able to manage all of the documents? I could imagine that if we're looking for information that's quite general, is it the way that the access is requested, that it will lead to a lot of documents needing to be reviewed. If the request is very vague, often institutions will try to reach out to the person requesting the documents and say to them, if I am to respond to this request, you are going to get millions of pages. So they ask for the scope to be made clearer. Sometimes people do not want to change their requests, and currently there is a measure in the legislation so they can ask me in order to not respond to an unreasonable request, in that the information requested would be too significant. Thank you. Mr. Thériault, you have the final question for 2.5 minutes. Thank you, Chair. You're very nice today. You talked about a list earlier. Do you have anything to add to it? For those who are listening to us, they might not have read your report. And I would like for you to share all of the changes that need to be made. So perhaps you could come back to that. There are a lot of improvements that could be made. One of the sections that is often brought up is 21 on advice and recommendations by public servants. This is often something that is overused. There's a list, and there are other measures in other legislation that would exempt certain information. For example, facts, statistics. And so we prepared a submission so that we could compare in order to help those who are applying the legislation to better respect Section 21. When we talk about legal reviews, these are things that are important to understand. Currently, my office can take part in a hearing, and it is important to keep that because often complainants are not represented. They don't see the file. We see it when we carry out an investigation, and I believe that the office should be able to represent the interests regarding the access to information and defend the implementation of the legislation. 30 seconds. On the increase in the numbers of complaints, do you have any explanation regarding, access requests, sorry. And there are a lot of complaints, but a lot of people want to know. They are asking questions, they're interested in what's going on, and I think that's one of the main reasons. Thank you very much, Mr. Thériault. And Madam Commissioner, on behalf of the committee, I would like to thank you for your testimony today. I would also like to thank the clerk, the analysts, and our technical team.
For today, the meeting is adjourned. We'll see you Wednesday at 4:30.